The doctor's words still echoed in my ears as I sat motionless in the hospital bed. "Early onset dementia," he had said with practiced sympathy, but I knew better. After 3 days of tests following my collapse at my 70th birthday party, I had overheard 2 nurses discussing my chart. They mentioned something about my symptoms being inconsistent with their observations. I decided to keep that information to myself. Something wasn't right, and I needed to understand what was happening before revealing my hand. My name is Franklin Winslow, and at 70 years old, I've built a life most men only dream of. A retired investment banker with a portfolio worth millions, a sprawling estate overlooking the Pacific, and a collection of rare vintage cars that made collectors weep with envy. What I didn't have anymore was my beloved wife Eleanor, who passed away last year after 43 years of marriage. What I did have were 3 children and 7 grandchildren who suddenly became extraordinarily attentive when my health took this unexpected turn. The first sign that something was deeply wrong came when my son-in-law Richard helped me to the bathroom the day after returning home. As he guided me with exaggerated care, I caught a glimpse of something in his pocket, a folded paper with my bank's letterhead. He'd never handled my finances before. That night, I made a decision that would change everything. I would play along with this diagnosis, observe, and gather evidence. My military training from decades ago came flooding back: patience, surveillance, strategic thinking. "Dad, you shouldn't strain yourself trying to remember everything," my youngest daughter Amelia said sweetly, sliding my checkbook away from me. "We'll take care of all this boring paperwork." Her smile didn't reach her eyes. I nodded vacantly, the perfect image of a confused old man, while mentally noting how quickly she tucked my financial documents into her designer handbag. Within 2 weeks, the vultures were circling. My eldest son, Jonathan, suddenly remembered a loan of $200,000 I had supposedly promised him years ago for his failing restaurant business. My middle child, Olivia, began discussing how, we all agreed, my house was too much for me to manage alone. And my grandson, Tyler, who'd never shown interest in my car collection, was now offering to take them for regular drives to keep the engines healthy. What they didn't know was that every night after they left, I meticulously documented everything in a journal I kept hidden behind a loose brick in the fireplace, a hiding spot Eleanor and I had used for decades to store emergency cash. I also began setting traps, deliberately misplacing items to see who would find them, leaving cash in visible spots to test who might pocket it, and mentioning false memories to track which fabrications would reappear in conversation. The breaking point came when I discovered my original will had been replaced with a new version in my home office. This document, which I supposedly signed 2 weeks earlier during my confused state, drastically reallocated my assets, giving Jonathan controlling interest in my investments, granting Olivia ownership of my house upon my inevitable move to assisted living, and dividing my car collection among the grandchildren. My lifelong charitable commitments to veterans organizations and Eleanor's Cancer Research Foundation had been reduced to pittances. I felt a cold fury building inside me, not the impotent rage of a helpless old man, but the calculated determination of someone who had survived boardroom battles and market crashes. These people thought they were dealing with a feeble, forgetful father. They had no idea who they were really up against. That night, I made a phone call to the one person I knew I could trust, Eleanor's brother, retired Judge Harold Mackenzie. "Harold?" I whispered into the phone, checking twice that the bathroom fan was running to mask my voice. "I need your help, but you can't let anyone know I called. Not yet." I explained the situation, including my suspicions about the true nature of my diagnosis. "My God, Franklin." Harold's voice was tight with controlled anger. "Have you considered that your collapse might not have been natural?" His words hit me like a physical blow. The birthday cake, the strange, bitter taste I'd noticed but dismissed. How quickly Richard had taken the plate away when I mentioned it. "I need to be sure," I replied, "and I need leverage, enough to make them pay for what they're trying to do to me." "What do you have in mind?" Harold asked. "Something they'll never see coming," I replied, a plan already forming in my mind. "But first, I need to know exactly what I'm dealing with medically. Can you get me secretly tested by someone you trust completely?" As I hung up the phone, I heard Olivia's voice calling up the stairs. "Dad, who are you talking to?" I flushed the toilet unnecessarily and turned on the sink. "Just talking to myself, sweetheart," I called back, injecting a confused quaver into my voice. "Sometimes I forget Eleanor isn't here to answer me." "Oh, Daddy," she said with exaggerated sympathy when I emerged. "You poor thing, why don't I stay overnight? You shouldn't be alone when you're having one of your episodes." I nodded gratefully while thinking, and so the game begins. They think I'm already defeated, but this old lion still has teeth, and they're about to learn what happens when you try to cage him. 3 days later, Harold's trusted neurologist confirmed what I had begun to suspect. There was nothing physiologically wrong with my brain. No dementia, no cognitive decline beyond the normal aging process. What the blood tests did reveal, however, were traces of scopolamine, a drug known to cause temporary memory loss, confusion, and suggestibility. Someone had been drugging me, likely for weeks, creating symptoms that mimicked cognitive decline. The doses weren't high enough to be lethal, Dr. Takostas explained in the discreet examination room Harold had arranged in a neighboring city. But consistent administration would certainly create the appearance of dementia to untrained observers. "And to trained ones?" I asked, my hands clenched into fists. "That's where they got sloppy. True dementia presents with consistent patterns. Your medical records show wildly fluctuating symptoms, extremely disoriented one day, nearly normal the next. Any competent specialist would question the diagnosis." I nodded, pieces falling into place. "So, my original doctor—" "Dr. Bernard Phillips," Harold interjected, consulting a notepad. "I've done some digging. He recently purchased a vacation home in Belize worth approximately $600,000. The timing is interesting." A cold weight settled in my stomach. This conspiracy ran deeper than I had imagined. My own children hadn't just opportunistically pounced on my apparent weakness, they had engineered it. This wasn't a crime of opportunity. It was premeditated betrayal. "What now, Franklin?" Harold asked, his face grim. "Now," I said, standing straighter than I had in weeks, "we gather evidence, and I continue the performance of a lifetime." Over the next 2 weeks, I became the most convincingly addled old man you could imagine. I'd shuffle aimlessly through rooms, calling my children by each other's names. I had become tearfully confused about whether Eleanor was alive or dead. All the while, Harold helped me install discreet recording devices throughout my home, modern technology hidden in vintage items my family would never suspect contained cameras or microphones. I also contacted Stanley Way, my personal attorney of 30 years, who had mysteriously been retired, according to my children. Stanley was outraged to learn he'd been circumvented and eager to help untangle the legal mess. Together with Harold, we formulated a 3-pronged strategy: gather evidence of the drugging, document the financial manipulation, and prepare legal consequences that would be devastating. The evidence came faster than we anticipated. The cameras caught Richard emptying the contents of a small vial into my evening tea when Olivia distracted me. They recorded Jonathan photographing documents from my home office safe, a safe whose combination I had forgotten, but conveniently shared with him during one of my episodes. Most damning of all was the conversation between my 3 children in my kitchen, assuming I was asleep upstairs. How much longer do we need to keep drugging him? Olivia asked, her voice carrying clearly through the hidden microphone. I'm tired of playing nursemaid to a drooling old man. Until the transfer of assets is complete, Jonathan snapped. The paperwork for the trust restructuring takes time, and we need him compliant for at least 2 more signatures. Well, Tyler's getting impatient about the cars, Amelia added, and Richard's company needs that investment capital before the end of the quarter or the whole venture collapses. Your husband's failed businesses are not my problem, Jonathan retorted. Dad's portfolio gets divided according to the agreement, 40% to me, 30% to you, 30% to Olivia. After the specific allocations, Olivia corrected sharply. The house is mine outright. We agreed. Fine, but the Caribbean properties are mine, Jonathan insisted, and we all agreed the grandchildren get the cars instead of selling them. That keeps them quiet and happy. Listening to the recording with Harold and Stanley the next day, I felt strangely calm. The pain of betrayal had burned away, leaving only purpose. This is clearly criminal, Stanley said, stopping the playback. Elder abuse, drugging, fraud, conspiracy. They'll all serve time. That's not enough, I said quietly. Prison sentences won't restore what they've taken, my trust, my dignity, my relationship with my grandchildren, some of whom may be innocent in this. What are you suggesting? Harold asked, studying my face. I don't want them in prison, I replied. I want them ruined. Completely, utterly ruined, financially, socially, professionally. I want them to feel what I'm feeling now, the ground disappearing beneath their feet, everything they thought was certain crumbling away. Stanley looked uncomfortable. Franklin, revenge of that magnitude is exactly what they deserve, I finished firmly. They didn't just try to steal my money, Stanley. They stole my agency, my autonomy. They made me doubt my own mind. They used my grief for Eleanor against me. I leaned forward, and they're still doing it. Every false smile, every patronizing pat on the arm, every time they call me poor daddy, they're enjoying it, the power, the control. Harold nodded slowly. So what's your play? A thin smile spread across my face. First, we need to understand exactly what they believe they're getting. I need comprehensive information about every asset they think is coming their way. And then, Stanley pressed, then I'm going to give them exactly what they want, with modifications they won't discover until it's far too late. That night, as Jonathan helped me to bed with exaggerated patience, I allowed myself a moment of vulnerability. Real vulnerability, not the feigned kind I'd been performing. Jonathan, I said, clutching his hand as he turned to leave, I'm scared. What's happening to me? For a brief, heartbreaking moment, I thought I saw genuine concern flash across my son's face. Then it was gone, replaced by practiced sympathy. Don't worry, Dad, he said soothingly. We're taking care of everything. You just rest. As the door closed, I whispered to the empty room, yes, you're taking care of everything, and soon I'll take care of you. The next phase of my plan required perfect timing. With Harold's help, I arranged for a nurse, a former military medic named Marcus, who owed Harold a favor, to start visiting daily, supposedly to monitor my condition. In reality, Marcus was there to ensure I wasn't being drugged and to help establish the paper trail we needed. He began taking regular blood samples, documenting my actual cognitive state, and keeping meticulous records of my medication, both what was prescribed and what was actually being administered. Meanwhile, I started dropping strategic breadcrumbs for my children to follow. During a particularly confused episode, I mentioned to Amelia that I'd hidden valuables throughout the house, including Eleanor's special diamonds that weren't listed in any insurance documents. "What diamonds, Dad?" she asked, her casual tone betrayed by the sudden sharpness in her eyes. "The ones from Morocco," I mumbled vaguely. "After the ambassador. Well, you know." Your mother never wanted them appraised. Too risky. There were no diamonds, of course, but within hours I watched through the hidden cameras as Amelia and Richard tore apart my bedroom, moving from methodical searching to increasingly frantic ransacking. They found nothing but the journal I had planted, filled with seemingly addled ramblings, but containing coded references to offshore accounts that didn't exist. With Jonathan, I took a different approach. During his Sunday visit, I became distressed about the painting. "Which painting, Dad?" he asked, barely concealing his excitement. "The Kellerman," I whispered conspiratorially, "in the vault at Westridge Bank. Your mother never liked it, said it was too provocative, but it's worth millions now." The mythical Kellerman painting became an obsession for Jonathan. Through our surveillance, we recorded 3 separate phone calls where he contacted art dealers trying to discreetly determine the value of a recently rediscovered Kellerman original. His frustration grew when he couldn't access the non-existent safe deposit box. For Olivia, who had always been the most financially savvy, I created a more sophisticated lure. During a family dinner, I became confused about my investment portfolio, mixing up names and numbers until she stepped in to help. "Dad, you're thinking of the tech stocks, not the energy fund," she corrected, maintaining a facade of patience. No, I insisted. "The Singapore account, the one Walter manages." "Walter?" she repeated, exchanging glances with Jonathan. "My broker in Singapore," I said, as if it were obvious. "He handles the Asian investments. Very exclusive fund, tremendous returns." That night, Olivia spent hours on her laptop, searching for any trace of Singapore investments in my financial records. I could practically see the dollar signs in her eyes, calculating how much might be hidden away in accounts her original plan hadn't uncovered. The beauty of these false leads wasn't just in the wasted time and effort they caused my children. Each pursuit revealed their true motivations through recorded conversations, documented break-ins of my personal spaces, and unauthorized attempts to access financial information. Every action they took built our case stronger. By the end of the second week, Stanley had compiled a damning portfolio of evidence. "We have more than enough to bring criminal charges," he confirmed during our secure meeting at Harold's home. "But if you're serious about avoiding prosecution in favor of your alternative approach, we should move to the next phase." "I'm ready," I said. "Have you prepared the documents?" Stanley nodded grimly, opening his briefcase to reveal a stack of legal papers. "These are unlike anything I've drafted in my career. They're legally binding, but contain delayed triggers and cascading clauses that won't be apparent upon initial review." "And they'll pass scrutiny from their lawyers?" I asked. "Any lawyer they can afford will see what they expect to see," Stanley confirmed. "The real mechanisms are buried in reference documents and contingent clauses that activate under specific conditions. By the time those conditions occur, the transfers will be irrevocable." Perfect. Now I needed to set the stage for my family to receive their supposed victory. That evening I had Marcus help me to the dining room where my 3 children waited for our weekly family dinner. "I've been thinking," I announced, my voice deliberately frailer than it had been that morning, "about the future, about all of you." I looked around at their faces, the concern that never quite reached their eyes, the barely contained anticipation. "What about the future, Dad?" Jonathan asked, serving me the soup that I knew contained a dose of scopolamine. I discreetly emptied it into the potted plant beside me when he turned away. "I'm tired of fighting this fog in my head," I said, allowing my hands to tremble. "Maybe you're right. Maybe the house is too much. Maybe I should let you handle things." The sudden tension in the room was palpable, a predatory stillness, like sharks sensing blood in the water. "That's very sensible, Daddy," Olivia said, reaching for my hand. "We only want what's best for you." "I know you do, sweetheart," I replied, patting her hand. "That's why I've asked Stanley to come tomorrow, to update my arrangements." "Stanley?" Amelia asked sharply. "I thought he'd retired." "Oh, did he?" I blinked in confusion. "Well, I called his office. Someone's coming tomorrow to sign papers." The meaningful looks exchanged around the table told me everything. They thought they'd won. That night, the cameras recorded an urgent family meeting in my study. "This is it," Jonathan hissed. "He's giving in. We need to make sure the new papers align with what we've prepared." "What about this Singapore account?" Olivia demanded. "Or these diamonds Amelia's been tearing the house apart for?" "One thing at a time," Richard interjected. "Let's secure the assets we know about first. The house, the investments, the cars. Then we can work on extracting information about anything else." I smiled in the darkness of my bedroom, listening to them plan. They were so focused on what they thought they were getting that they never stopped to consider what they might be losing in the process. The next day, Stanley arrived with his associate, a young, nervous-looking lawyer who was actually a seasoned actor Harold knew. My children hovered as I signed document after document, appearing to transfer control of my assets into their waiting hands. "There," I said finally, setting down the pen. "It's done. You'll take care of everything now." "We will, Dad," Jonathan assured me, unable to completely hide his triumphant smile. "You won't have to worry about a thing ever again." How right he was, though not in the way he imagined. As Stanley gathered the papers, I caught his eye and gave the slightest nod. Phase 2 was complete. Now we would wait for the trap to spring, a trap my children had walked into willingly, believing they were the hunters rather than the prey. The waiting was the hardest part. For 2 weeks I maintained my performance as the doddering, confused father while my children began exercising their newly acquired control over my affairs. Olivia started meeting with architects about renovations to my home. Jonathan began restructuring my investment portfolio, liquidating positions to fund his restaurant expansion. Amelia and her husband Richard took not one but 3 of my vintage cars to get them serviced, returning none. All the while, Marcus continued his daily visits, documenting everything while pretending to monitor my declining health. Stanley worked behind the scenes, ensuring all the legal mechanisms were in place for what would come next. And I waited, building my strength, carefully disposing of the drugs they still attempted to give me, and preparing for the moment when I would reveal that the old lion wasn't just alive, he was ready to pounce. That moment came sooner than expected due to my grandson Tyler's unexpected visit. At 22, Tyler had always been different from his cousins, quieter, more thoughtful, more like Eleanor in his gentle approach to life. He'd been away at graduate school during most of my decline and had only heard about it through family phone calls. "Grandpa," he said hesitantly, finding me alone in the garden where I'd been secretly exercising to rebuild my strength. "Mom said you wouldn't recognize me, but you look fine." I studied his face carefully, looking for any sign of complicity in his parents' scheme. I saw only confusion and concern. A realization struck me. Not all of my family had betrayed me. Some might be innocent bystanders, about to be caught in the crossfire of my revenge. "Tyler," I said, my voice stronger than it had been in public for weeks, "I need you to listen carefully. Can I trust you?" His brow furrowed. "Of course, but—" "Not here," I interrupted, glancing toward the house where Olivia might return any moment. "There's a blue envelope in the glove compartment of my Mercedes, the one they haven't taken yet. Bring it to me tonight without telling anyone. Can you do that?" He nodded, clearly bewildered but willing to help. That night, after the household had gone to sleep, Tyler slipped into my room with the envelope containing instructions I'd prepared for just such a contingency, a way to protect the innocent members of my family from what was about to happen. "Grandpa, what's going on?" he whispered after reading the letter. "Are you saying Mom and the others have been drugging you, stealing from you?" "I'm afraid so," I replied softly, "and I'm about to stop them. But I needed to warn you first. Things are going to get ugly, and I didn't want you caught in the blast radius." Tyler's face hardened in a way that reminded me so much of Eleanor when she was angry. "I want to help," he said firmly. "Tell me what to do." With Tyler's unexpected alliance, the timeline accelerated. The next morning, I sent him to Harold with a message: "Execute Phase 3 immediately." Then I did the hardest thing yet. I continued playing my role for one more day, allowing my children their final moments of false triumph. That evening we gathered for dinner as usual. Jonathan was practically glowing after closing a deal using my investment funds. Olivia was showing everyone the renovation plans that would transform my home, Eleanor's dream house that we had designed together, into something unrecognizable. Amelia and Richard were discussing which cars they would help me sell next. I waited until dessert was served before I straightened in my chair, set down my spoon, and spoke in my normal voice, strong, clear, and absolutely terrifying in its calmness. "I think that's quite enough," I said. The conversation around me stuttered to a halt. 4 pairs of eyes turned to stare. "Dad," Olivia said uncertainly, "are you feeling all right?" "Actually, Olivia, I'm feeling better than I have in months. Ever since I stopped ingesting the scopolamine you've been putting in my food." The silence that followed was absolute. I could almost see the calculations running behind their eyes. Denial, confusion, more gaslighting. "I don't know what you're talking about," Jonathan attempted, but his voice lacked conviction. "Don't you?" I removed a small recording device from my pocket and placed it on the table. This contains approximately 47 hours of recordings from this house, including conversations about how long you need to keep drugging me, discussions about how you'll divide my assets, and detailed planning of how you've manipulated my medical care. The blood drained from their faces simultaneously. Richard recovered first. "You can't prove—" "I can prove everything," I cut him off. "The blood tests showing scopolamine in my system, the recordings of you administering it, the documentation of financial transfers you've already begun making, the falsified medical records that Dr. Phillips created— yes, I know about him too— and his new vacation home in Belize." I stood up slowly, enjoying how they shrank back in their chairs. "But here's what's truly interesting," I continued. "For the past 2 weeks, you believed you were in control of my estate. You've been making decisions, signing documents, transferring funds. But there's something you should know about those documents Stanley brought." "What documents?" Amelia whispered, though she already knew. "The ones that appeared to give you control over my assets," I explained calmly. "They were very real, legally binding in fact, but they didn't do what you thought they did." I pressed a button on my phone, and the dining room filled with the sound of an incoming video call. Stanley's face appeared on the screen, along with Harold and Marcus. "Is it time, Franklin?" Stanley asked. "It's time," I confirmed. "Send the notifications." As if choreographed, my children's phones began chiming with email alerts. I watched with satisfaction as they frantically reached for their devices, faces growing more horrified with each swipe. What is this?" Jonathan stammered, his face ashen. "That," I said, "is the sound of consequences. The documents you so eagerly had me sign," I explained, savoring each word, "contained a series of delayed triggers activated by specific conditions, all of which you've now met through your actions these past 2 weeks." I walked slowly around the table, pausing behind each of my children as I detailed their specific downfalls. "Jonathan," I said, resting my hands on his suddenly rigid shoulders, "the investment authority you thought you received was real. Every transaction you made was legal and binding. What you didn't realize was that you were trading with your own assets, not mine." His face contorted in confusion. "That's impossible." "The ownership of those accounts transferred to you the moment you signed the acceptance papers," Stanley explained from the video call. "But a secondary clause simultaneously collateralized them against Mr. Winslow's charitable foundation. Every liquidation you've initiated to fund your restaurant has been selling your own newly acquired assets, with the proceeds flowing directly to veterans organizations." You've liquidated approximately $3.2 million of your own money in the past 11 days, I added. Congratulations on your extraordinary generosity. Moving to Olivia, I continued, those renovation plans look expensive, sweetheart. It's fortunate you now own the house and can afford them. What do you mean, now own? She asked, her voice barely audible. The deed transferred to you last Tuesday, I confirmed, along with all associated tax liabilities, maintenance costs, and historical preservation requirements. Did I forget to mention this house is a protected historical landmark? Any renovations must be approved by the Historical Society, which coincidentally I've served on for 15 years. They've already rejected your plans, unanimously. Her face crumpled. But the taxes alone are over $180,000 annually, I finished for her. Due next month, actually. I've always paid them early. I moved to stand between Amelia and Richard. Those cars you've been so eager to service are now legally yours, as are the specialized maintenance contracts, import tariffs for the foreign parts, and the insurance premiums. The Ferrari alone costs $32,000 annually to maintain properly. I believe the insurance payment is due next week. We'll just sell them, Richard snapped, though panic edged his voice. You certainly could, I agreed pleasantly, though the transfer documents include a non-sale covenant for 7 years. Breaking it would trigger a tax reassessment at full market value, due immediately. But they're all yours to enjoy, if you can afford them. I returned to my seat at the head of the table, facing my stunned children. In essence, you've all received exactly what you wanted, control of my assets. What you failed to understand is that wealth isn't just about ownership. It's about management, responsibility, and liquidity. You can't do this, Jonathan protested weakly. I already have, I replied. Everything was done legally with your full signatures, witnessed and notarized. The same legal system you tried to use against me has now been turned to my advantage. But where does that leave you? Amelia asked, a desperate calculation visible behind her eyes. If we have everything, what do you have? I smiled. Excellent question. While you were all focusing on the assets you could see, I've been quietly living off a separate portfolio for years, one Eleanor and I established decades ago. The visible wealth you've coveted represents less than 40% of my actual holdings. The shock on their faces was almost comical. Almost. What about our children? Olivia asked suddenly. Your grandchildren? Will you punish them for our mistakes? Another excellent question, I acknowledged, nodding toward the doorway where Tyler now stood. Tyler has been helping me identify which of my grandchildren were involved in your scheme and which were innocent bystanders. Those who had no part in this will be provided for through trusts they cannot access until they're 30, and which none of you can touch. You've been helping him? Amelia hissed at her son, betrayal and fury in her eyes. Someone in this family had to show some integrity, Tyler replied quietly. This is just the beginning, I continued. The financial consequences are only part of your punishment. At 9 a.m. tomorrow, every major business associate, social connection, and community organization you're involved with will receive documentation of what you've done, the drugging, the manipulation, the elder abuse, not through anonymous sources, but through formal ethics complaints with my name attached. The color drained from their faces. In their social and professional circles, such a scandal would be devastating. You wouldn't, Olivia whispered. Your own reputation will be enhanced by my willingness to stand up against elder abuse, even when perpetrated by my own children, I finished for her. I've already spoken with the district attorney, an old golfing buddy. While I've chosen not to press criminal charges, I've made it clear that should any of you contest these financial arrangements, my cooperation with the prosecution would be immediate and comprehensive. I stood again, feeling taller than I had in months. You have until tomorrow morning to vacate my house. Any possessions remaining will be considered abandoned. Your electronic access to the property has already been revoked. Where are we supposed to go? Amelia demanded. That's not my concern, I replied coldly. though I understand foreclosures offer very competitive square footage prices these days. As security personnel that Harold had arranged entered the dining room, I watched my children's faces transform, shock giving way to understanding, then to the dawning horror of their new reality. "One last thing," I said as they were escorted toward the door. "Eleanor knew. Before she died, she suspected something wasn't right with how you behaved around her medication, her jewelry. She didn't want to believe it, but she knew. Her last coherent words to me were, 'Be careful of the vultures, my love.' I didn't understand then. I do now." That final revelation, that their mother had seen through them as well, was the killing blow. Whatever composure they had maintained crumbled completely. As the doors closed behind them, I sank into my chair, feeling the weight of both victory and loss. I had won completely and irrevocably. But at what cost? "Are you all right, Grandpa?" Tyler asked gently, his hand on my shoulder. "I will be," I assured him, looking up at the portrait of Eleanor that hung over the fireplace. I did what needed to be done. That night, for the first time in months, I slept peacefully without the need to keep one eye open. The war was over. And in the morning, I would begin rebuilding what remained of my family from the ashes of betrayal. Here's a revised version of Part 6, slightly longer but still shorter than the original. The aftermath of what my grandchildren now call the reckoning unfolded in ways both expected and surprising. As promised, the morning after brought professional and social devastation for my 3 children. Jonathan's restaurant investors pulled out within hours of receiving the evidence packages. Olivia was asked to resign from 3 charitable boards by lunchtime. Amelia and Richard's Country Club membership was suspended, pending a review that everyone knew would end in expulsion. But revenge, I discovered, isn't the pure satisfaction I had anticipated during those long nights of planning. It came laced with complexity, moments of vindication intertwined with flashes of grief for what might have been, what should have been. 2 weeks after the reckoning, I sat in Harold's study, reviewing the financial fallout with him and Stanley. The numbers told a story of spectacular implosion. "Jonathan had to declare bankruptcy yesterday," Stanley reported. "The restaurant space is being auctioned next month. His home goes into foreclosure next week." "Olivia's husband filed for divorce," Harold added. "He's seeking full custody of their children, citing her moral turpitude as evidence of unfitness." "And Amelia?" I asked, my voice steadier than I expected. "She and Richard have listed their vacation properties. The cars they took, your cars, are sitting unused because they can't afford the insurance. They've been trying to challenge the non-sale covenant, but no lawyer will take the case." I nodded, feeling hollow rather than triumphant. "And the grandchildren? The innocent ones?" "The trusts are established as you requested," Stanley confirmed. 5 of your 7 grandchildren will receive their education fully funded and access to their trusts at 30. Tyler has agreed to serve as co-trustee with me." I stood and walked to the window, watching autumn leaves swirl across Harold's lawn. I thought destroying them would fill the hole their betrayal left. Instead, I've just created more emptiness. "Revenge rarely brings the satisfaction we expect," Harold said gently. "What you did was necessary, not just for justice, but for protection. They would have continued to prey on you. You stopped that cycle." A month later, I received my first communication from one of my children, a letter from Olivia, handwritten on cheap stationery. "I won't ask for forgiveness," she wrote. "I don't deserve it. But I need you to know that I understand what I threw away, not just financially, but in betraying the father who gave me everything. I'm seeking help to understand why I became someone capable of hurting the people who loved me most." I read the letter 7 times, unable to determine if it represented genuine remorse or another manipulation. 6 weeks later, Tyler organized a dinner with the 5 grandchildren uninvolved in their parents' schemes. The conversation was awkward at first, but gradually shifted toward memories and tentative laughter. "Grandpa," my youngest granddaughter Sophie asked, "will you ever forgive them?" "Forgiveness isn't a single moment, Sophie. It's a process. What they did was calculated and cruel, but they're still my children, still your mother's blood." "Tyler says you could have sent them all to prison, but chose not to." I nodded. Revenge and justice aren't the same thing. I wanted consequences, not annihilation. By the 6-month mark, Jonathan had left the country, reportedly teaching English in Southeast Asia. Amelia and Richard had divorced, with Amelia moving in with Olivia in a modest apartment 2 states away. According to Tyler, both sisters were working retail jobs and attending therapy. I had established a new routine: Tuesday dinners with the grandchildren who wished to attend, Thursday chess with Harold, daily walks that gradually increased in length as my true health improved. I donated Eleanor's clothing but kept her photographs everywhere. On the anniversary of the reckoning, I contacted Stanley and revised my estate plans. While my children would never again control my finances, I established a conditional path to limited reconciliation: small trusts that would activate only after verified completion of counseling programs and community service, and structured, supervised visitation opportunities with their children. "Are you sure about this?" Stanley asked. "It's what Eleanor would advise," I replied. She always believed in redemption, even when evidence suggested otherwise. That evening, as sunset painted my garden in amber and gold, Tyler joined me on the bench Eleanor and I had shared for countless summer evenings. "Grandma would be proud of you," he said quietly, "for defending yourself, and for not letting their betrayal destroy your capacity for compassion." In that moment, I felt Eleanor's presence more strongly than I had since her passing, not in some mystical sense, but in the values that guided our life together: strength without cruelty, justice tempered with mercy, the courage to protect oneself without surrendering to bitterness. My revenge had been complete and devastating, the consequences my children faced entirely of their making. But in preserving the possibility of redemption, however remote, I had honored something essential about Eleanor, about myself, about the family we had tried to build. Franklin Winslow, betrayed but unbroken, still capable of growth, of forgiveness, of love. In the end, that was my greatest revenge, not the destruction of those who betrayed me, but the preservation of my own humanity in the face of their cruelty.